Hey there, friends. John Papola here, and I just wanted to take a brief moment to tee up this sort of unique episode of Dad Saves America. I was invited by Zero Hedge to moderate a debate about whether or not the United States could or should replace the income tax with tariffs on international trade. It's a really interesting and thought-provoking debate and discussion, and it's super germane in our age of resurgent tariffs and trade wars. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Hey everyone, and welcome to a Zero Hedge debate about whether or not we should abolish the income tax in the United States. We have two illustrious economic minds joining us today to debate these and many other subjects. My name is John Papola. I'm the host of Dad Saves America on YouTube, and I will be moderating the debate and trying not to tip the scales excessively despite my own biases. I want to also thank JM Bullion for being the sponsor of this debate series. And I would like to first intro our two combatants. We didn't flip a coin, so I will flip one in my mind. I looked at you, Noah, and so why don't we start with you, Noah Smith. He is an economic journalist, the author at No Opinion. And why don't you actually tell the folks a little bit about yourself, Noah?
Oh, well, all I do is blog about economics and related topics. You can check out my Substack. It's called No Opinion, Noahpinion. Got my econ PhD at University of Michigan, worked as a professor for a short time at Stony Brook University. I have a pet rabbit. He's really cute, but he's asleep right now under the bed, so I can't show him to you. That's pretty much it. And not too interesting.
And in the other corner of the grand debate, Peter, if I mispronounce your name, correct me. Peter St. Ange.
Yeah, you pulled it off. Perfect.
And Peter is longtime Austrian thinker. He is, I'll let you take it away, Peter.
Okay, I do daily videos on economics and freedom. They mostly go up on X. I also have a Substack. Everybody has one nowadays at Prof. St. Ange. I was a professor in a business school out in Taiwan for about 5 years, but I really peaked as a bartender about 30 years ago. I still ask myself why I didn't continue with that career. And yes, I've been an Austrian. I discovered it in a random bookstore on a side street in the 1990s. I had learned nothing about it all the way through my BA anyway. And ever since then, I'd probably call myself a Rothbardian.
Of the more radical sort. So I think the question at hand is, should Trump attempt to abolish the income tax in the United States, established as it currently exists, initially in 1913 under the glorious reign of Woodrow Wilson. Why don't we start with you, Peter, since I believe you're going to be in favor of the change, and we'll take it so why don't you give us your 2 to 3 minute case for your position?
Okay, so in short, of course, the income tax is evil, but we're talking about economics here. And so the prospect at issue is that Trump has suggested, most specifically with Joe Rogan, he suggested raising tariffs and then using that initially to offset some of the income tax, but he finally just came out and said, maybe we should just get rid of the entire income tax and the federal government can live off tariffs like it did before 1913. So the question is that a good idea? So I would argue that it is for a couple reasons. One of them is that it would grow the economy. So back of envelope, about 20% growth in the economy within a relatively short term. And then over time, that it might double the rate of economic growth because of the improved incentives to produce. Of course, taxes, the reason you tax something is to have less of it. And so the reason that or an unintended consequence, presumably, of the income tax is less production. In addition, it would save people about $18,000 in income tax. Now, you would have some tariff on that, so that might raise taxes by about $3,000. That's from the Tax Policy Center. So you put the two of them together and you get something like a 50% increase in incomes in the short term, and that then keeps paying in the long term as economic growth increases. The main downside to it, not to me, but to many other people, is that it would shrink the federal government. Of course, before the income tax in 1913, we had a government that was roughly 10 times smaller than it is today. It strikes me as a wonderful thing that we could get rid of the useless or contentious things that our government does, the federal government, and basically live off tariff income, which would likely be, at any rate, the tariff today or the income tax rather, collects something like $2.5 trillion. Tariffs, as Trump is discussing them, might raise something like 800 or 900 billion at most, so you would have a substantial decrease in government, at least 30% in the short term, and hopefully much more over the long term.
Right. So we should shrink the state radically, and the incentives of getting to keep more of your money will grow the economy and we'll all be better off. That is Peter's position. Noah, what say you?
Well, I think when you're talking about the type of taxes that you use to fund stuff, I think you should think there's really two questions there. There's the question of how much stuff should you fund? Should you really be doing all this government spending that you need to fund with taxes? And the second question is how, if you want to fund it, for a given amount of funding, how do you fund it? Do you use income taxes, tariffs, or VATs or some other thing like that? I think those are kind of two separate questions, and if we consider them together, I think it can obscure more than it enlightens. So because those have very separate effects, and so I think that if we're talking about a fixed level of government spending, and we're not going to do suppose we're not going to do any spending cuts or any of that. And we're just doing a hypothetical where we hold that fixed and we're trying to figure out how do we fund that? Like what taxes do we use to fund that? I don't think there's much of a case that income taxes are more distortionary than tariffs. And I think that when you're talking about a tax, what's bad about it? You're talking about the distortion of economic activity. Taxing anything makes people do less of it, right? If you tax income, that makes people do less of the stuff that gets them income, which is primarily, working. And so people will work less, and that will cause a deadweight loss to the economy. And this is the sort of the price of taxation. They call it the leaky bucket. It's like the leak. You're carrying water from the people you want to tax to the things you want to spend it on, and some of it leaks out, and that leaky bucket is the deadweight loss, right? So income taxes have that. Tariffs have that. The only tax that has no deadweight loss at all, there's the head tax, which is just, hey, you're a person, you get taxed $10, right? I think Margaret Thatcher proposed that for about 5 seconds before it got shot down. But then, or that was also called the poll tax. But then this doesn't raise much money because you have to set it to some amount that like the poor people can actually pay, and so nobody does that. The other one is a land tax. So you have a Georgist land tax. Land isn't going anywhere. You can't have less of it. You can't have less land than you did before. So if you manage to tax land, which has some logistical issues, which we could go into if you ever want to do that. But if you manage to tax land, and actually tax the value of land and not the structures that are built on the land or the natural resources under the land, blah, 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 blah. If you just tax the land itself, if you can do that, that should have zero deadweight loss. But income tax has a deadweight loss, tariffs have the deadweight loss, sales tax has a deadweight loss, and all these others have a deadweight loss. So when you're asking what's the most efficient form of taxation, you're really just asking what's the deadweight loss? How much do we discourage economic activity with this tax? And I think that when you look at the empirical estimates of of how much income tax and tariffs both affect economic activity, you see that tariffs are a bit higher in terms of how much economic activity they curb for a given amount of revenue that you raise than income taxes. And so neither one is particularly huge in terms of how much economic activity it destroys. Like the deadweight losses for these are not as big as, say, corporate income tax, which has a higher deadweight loss. But they're higher than a land tax, for example, or maybe even just normal property tax. The deadweight losses are a bit higher than those ones, and they're higher than sales tax, actually. Sales tax has a lower deadweight loss, but tariffs and income tax Both have like a moderate, medium level of deadweight loss, and I think that tariffs are a little bit higher. And I'll tell you why tariffs are a little bit higher in theory, which is that tariffs affect both final goods and intermediate goods. Intermediate goods are, when you have a car company, your car company to make cars has to buy steel and aluminum and blah blah blah. And some of the stuff it gets domestically, some it gets overseas, right? But when you tax intermediate goods, that basically functions like a corporate income tax instead of a personal income tax in the theory. And what that means is that it's effectively like a double taxation that you get from taxing those intermediate goods. So tariffs, in terms of raising a given amount of revenue, are a bit worse than income tax. They're not the worst I could think of, but they're a bit worse than income tax. And I think when you look at countries around the world, you can see that very few use tariffs as opposed to income tax to generate substantial amounts of revenue. You could say, oh, well, it's all because of international agreements, world government, and blah, blah, blah. But honestly, there's a lot of governments that don't really care that much about any of that stuff and would be happy to do tariffs if it raised revenue more efficiently than income tax. And they don't. We don't see countries really shifting from income tax toward tariffs. And I think that the theory behind this that says that tariffs impede supply chains, impede the production process in ways that income taxes don't, it gives us a ready explanation for why. Now, I don't know that that's actually the explanation for why, but it is a possible explanation for why, and it makes sense. Because these tariffs on intermediate goods are very harmful to production processes. They gum up the process of production and effectively act like double taxation. So that's why I'm against the proposition of repealing. Now, if you want to cut government spending, that's another debate we can have, and I think we should have that debate because we have quite a lot of time today. But just in terms of tariff versus income tax for a given amount of revenue, probably not the best idea.
Okay, real quick, before we get back to the debate, I want to remind you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you really love what we're doing, be sure to, after finish watching this, head over to dadsavesamerica.com and subscribe, because that'll be the best way you can support what we're doing here and keep up with all our latest videos. And now, back to the debate. So, Peter, you should definitely reply in kind and grasp for time, and I will whip you, Noah, for for timing if I can. No, I'm just kidding. We've got plenty of time.
Wait, don't we have till 3 p.m.?
We have enormous amounts of time.
We have enormous amounts of time.
So just to summarize, you're leaving aside whether or not we should have any other level of government spending than we currently need to fund. And tariffs are going to distort the economy in ways that are bad for people worse than the income tax. Is that a fair sort of summary, Noah? Is that why you would rather us stay where we're at than shift towards tariffs?
Well, I think the reality is more complicated than that, but in the interest of time, let's say yes, that's a good argument.
All right, so Peter, what's your response?
Yeah, so starting out, the amount that we spend and how we finance that, they're certainly separate topics. We can discuss those separately. But the issue is that politics is the art of the possible, and you kind of have to take the opportunities as they come. So for sure, I would hope that we can discuss them both. And of course, how you raise money is intrinsically related to how much you can raise. So maybe one of the more famous examples is Milton Friedman's, his withholding, right, where it ends up hiding the tax. So for instance, if we raised income tax where you had to pay it on December 24th as a lump sum every single year, this would be psychologically, sort of more prominent for a lot of people. And so, taxes are specifically designed often so that they can be hidden. The sales tax, for example, there are lively debates about whether it should be revealed on the receipt or whether it should be hidden, like VATs might be. So, they are intrinsically linked. The reason we're having this debate in the first place, of course, is because Trump is linking them. Now, Trump has endorsed tariffs for a long time, at least since 2016, of course. I've never been a particularly big fan of tariffs. I agree with Noah that they are distortionary. Given a choice, I would prefer a sales tax in general. which tends to cover a broader range of items. Not entirely, again, it depends on the jurisdiction. A lot of things are exempted from sales tax as well. But nonetheless, what sort of motivates me to speak out on this particular subject is the notion that it ties into, I believe, a overall shrinking of government. Not even necessarily just because of the direct trade-off when the proposal comes in, but just that tariffs, like sales taxes, I think are more visible to people. I think that they'll be more discussed. The reason why you go with an income tax in the first place is because you can raise an enormous amount of money with fairly little protest. Lest we forget the Tea Party back in Boston. That was over, I believe, tax rates. I mean, the amount of money the British government was trying to raise was trivial in modern terms, and yet here we are at something like 50% of GDP being spent by all levels of government, and we do not have Boston Tea Parties. So I do think they're definitely connected, and that's a big part of why I am such a fan of this kind of notion. I think also that the sort of damage caused by tariffs in general, I think, is overstated by most economists. It's sort of an article of faith among economists that free trade is good, which I completely agree with. However, I think that the magnitudes are the question here. And I've gone through the data on the impacts of changes in income tax versus other taxes. If you try to represent, so one of my favorite papers on this is by Christina Romer, I believe with David Romer, from, I want to say 91. And they found that for every dollar of additional taxes you raise, you destroy about $3 worth of GDP. So that's not a leaky bucket. I mean, that's a bucket with a gaping hole in the center. You are massively destroying wealth by raising taxes from any source. Now, unfortunately, in that study, they did not disaggregate. Are they talking tariffs? Are they talking sales taxes? Are they talking income? I think it's fair to say, Noah, you might disagree, but that sort of a general ranking among economists is that corporate taxes are the worst in terms of sort of collateral damage. Income taxes are not quite as bad. Probably property tax is somewhere in the middle, and then I guess sales tax is generally accepted as the least distortionary. Correct me if you have a different hierarchy there. But sort of going down that list there, I would generally prefer to replace income tax with sales tax. That is not on the table. Trump is not going to propose that because, of course, it's deeply unpopular. It's very visible to people. It also affects domestic production, so attacking foreigners is always more popular in politics, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. And so when we sort of bring it into that art of the possible, how can we move from a relatively destructive tax, i.e. the income tax, towards something less destructive, given the political realities, i.e. that foreigners are being targeted, and also given the sort of side benefits that this would make a given level of taxation more painful to people, and so it might lead towards, you wouldn't have the kind of sort of inflation in tax revenue that we've seen in income tax if we had it with tariffs. There's the additional sort of side note that, Noah mentioned earlier that countries don't generally finance very much of their revenue by tariffs, and I think that one reason for that might just be reciprocity. Right, so if a country just willy-nilly runs around raising its tariff rates, it is going to get hit in kind, and so there's sort of a natural limit to how much revenue you can raise with tariffs. So if Trump puts them in at 10%, I doubt that they're going to creep up the way that income taxes have over the years. Right, if we look at 1913, the initial income tax was targeting only the top 1% of people, which, like foreigners, is a very popular political target. And then over time it expanded. Tariffs are not going to do that.
At JM Bullion, excellent service and competitive pricing aren't just goals, they're our standard. Our commitment to customer discretion and privacy with secure and confidential transactions has earned us an unparalleled reputation as an online retailer of precious metals, backed by over 375,000 reviews, averaging 4.8 out of 5 stars. Only at JM Bullion.
Yeah, I was looking ahead of coming on together. The history is quite striking. The income tax is instituted in 1913. It is positioned as this thing that's only going to hit a tiny percentage of the population, and tax rates go to 77% to fund World War One just 5 years later. So
91% in World War II, right? Yep.
right. So then, then they come back down as Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge sort of slam the brakes, but they're right back up and stay super high until JFK, and then they don't get below 50% until Reagan. So you really have an enormous ratchet effect, to your point, right? That it just seems like the history is pretty easy to hike these taxes up to as close to 100% as one could imagine. So Noah, how do you respond to that?
Well, yeah. So I think that when you start making these political economic cases, like if we do this kind of taxes, it'll naturally tend to restrain government spending, and we want to restrain government spending. Whereas if we do these other kinds of taxes, it will not restrain government spending. I think I'm just really not sure whether those work. I'm not sure about those. I think about those and I'm like, maybe sounds legit, but I don't know any evidence for or against that kind of thing. I will say, when we're talking about a sales tax is less distortionary than, it's not the least distortionary tax that exists, but it's less distortionary than an income tax typically. With a sales tax, so actually this is something that Europe and Japan get fairly right. Europe has these really big states. They fund healthcare, they fund all these kind of things. They spend a lot on their social stuff, but they finance a lot of it with VATs, which are fancy sales taxes. A VAT's a sales tax, and VATs are, it's really like a sales tax out of an economics textbook, out of an advanced economics textbook, because they're designed not to tax intermediate goods, and so then so you don't get the double taxation. So you really get this not very. So, in fact, our normal sales taxes are a bit more distortionary than a VAT. Like if you just tax at the cash register, because you're put. Anyway, I won't go into that, but they're not bad. But VATs are really non-distortionary, and Europe uses VATs, and that's how they get away with having such big states in Denmark and Sweden and stuff like that. They use a VAT. So if we could do that, that would be one thing. And VATs also would, if Trump thought about this, or his people actually thought carefully about this, they'd realize that VATs also do a border adjustment, which would get, we could replace corporate tax with a VAT. Corporate tax is the most distortionary tax. If you want to get rid of the most distortionary taxes, you want to get rid of corporate taxes before you get rid of individual income taxes. Corporate taxes are more distortionary than individual income taxes because instead of taxing work, they tax investment. So they're taxing you today and they're taxing the compound value of investment far in the future. So replacing corporate income tax with a VAT would be smart, but we don't do it. And it's not on the table and no one's suggesting it. And there's this kind of neat thing called DBCFT, which is a very wonky tax that I like, which makes our corporate income tax a little more like a VAT. But anyway, that aside, it's not on the table. No one's talking about it, right? And so we get into this. So you're right that sales taxes are less distortionary, and that would be less distortionary. So if you're talking about just changing the way we fund stuff, the biggest decrease in distortions would be just to switch corporate income tax for a VAT. That's like the lowest hanging fruit there. But nobody's talking about it. Anyway, in terms of the tariff stuff, I think you really hit on something, Peter, when you talked about retaliation. So if you raise tariffs on imported goods, your trade partners are going to raise their tariffs on your exported goods too. So in that sense, that's a political economic thing that we kind of know happens. We see these trade wars happen all the time. Tit for tat tariffs. It's not even, it happened to us in 2018. China raised tariffs on our agricultural goods, and a lot of farmers got hurt by that. And so you do have to take into account that political economic effect. So, and I think that is a reason why you see countries not really doing tariffs a lot. That is a reason, and it's probably a good reason. So, but if we're talking about the political economics effect of tariffs versus income tax in terms of like starve the beast, right? Income taxes can get pretty high, and tariffs, will make people more mad, so they'll vote to restrain government spending, right? Well, maybe. But what have we seen when we've done income tax cuts and not replaced with anything? in the we've done it a number of times. What we've mostly seen is deficits, right? Mostly what we've seen is deficits go up. They went up under Reagan, they went up under Bush, and they even went up under Trump. Although Trump cut corporate income tax, so they went up by less because corporate tax more distortionary, so you get some of the offset there. But we saw cutting the income tax has raised deficits. I guess it didn't raise deficits much when Kennedy did it, because the income taxes were so high that you were maybe even on the other side of the Laffer curve, or maybe near the peak of the Laffer curve, and so you didn't get much reduction in revenue. But by the time that Reagan and Bush started doing their big income tax cuts, you saw a lot of decrease in revenue, so people just did deficit spending. So now we've got deficits of large percentages of debts of large percent of GDP, and part of that was from Obama and Trump era stuff. With COVID and the Great Recession, you could call that emergency spending. But a lot of it was like spending in the middle of booms from just cutting income taxes. From Reagan, from George W. Bush, they cut income taxes in the middle of these booms. And you saw the debt really grow under those presidents. And so you didn't have this political economic effect of starve the beast. It didn't seem to work. So that's why I'm very wary of those political economic arguments that if we can't tax, we'll restrain spending. Well, maybe we will, or maybe we'll just be dorks and run up really high debts.
I want to shift to the actual, ultimately, I think, philosophical question of what should the government spending be and be on. But Peter, how do you respond to NOAA claiming that the tax cuts have been deficit contributors? Because my understanding, certainly with 2017, but maybe even with the slightly more distant ones, is didn't government revenue go up in 2018, 2019? So laying the deficit at the foot of the tax cut doesn't seem like a accurate representation of things. Am I missing something? Peter, why don't you weigh in, and then Noah, you could respond.
Yeah, it's tricky, and this is a problem throughout macroeconomics, which is the aggregation problem. So there are a lot of things happening in the economy at any given moment. The population is increasing. You've got technological improvements. China is making cheap toasters. There's a lot of stuff happening. And so to a certain degree, macroeconomic statistics will tell you whatever you want it to say, or whatever you're paid for it to say. And so it's tricky. So yes, revenue went up after the tax cuts, but that's because our economy has been growing for 250 years. I think that, if we sort of zoom in, the 2017 TCJA, so Trump's tax cuts, those are now estimated to have, quote unquote, paid for themselves. But again, the problem is disaggregating. So how much of that was increased investment, if at all? How much of it, a lot happened between 2017 and now, like COVID. So, I mean, for all the noise that happened, to try to sort of zoom in there and look at what this floating cork was doing is tricky. But I think sort of a broader point in terms of starving the beast, deficits also, ever since really Richard Nixon, I would argue that Nixon, the removal of constraints on increases in the money supply is what has been driving deficits, and that has been occurring after tax cuts, after tax hikes, after tax anythings, because it is, following a different beat. And so, but more than that, I think that, so in other words, yes, deficits went up after tax cuts, they went up after everything. Deficits also have been about a 55-year trend here, where I think we had a 3-year period with Bill Clinton where we didn't have deficits, and that was it. So those are pretty much a constant. But I think that, the starving the beast is one thing, but I think the other question is that I would score success as simply shifting any resources whatsoever to the private sector. So, if we cut taxes and then Congress looks at that as an opportunity to fill in the gaps, that's fine, because what I'm interested in is taking sort of, money, so bidding tickets to real resources, and redistributing those bidding tickets to people who will do something useful with them, like growing the economy. Of course, some of them will buy yachts or doing something relatively less economically productive, but a certain percent will be spent on production, whereas the dollars that go into government The percent that actually go to production, I think, is vanishingly low. I think there's a much, much higher percent that actually goes to predation on the economy. So in other words, if you raise taxes by 10 million and use it to hire a bunch of EPA bureaucrats, the problem isn't their salary. The problem isn't the 10 million per se. It's that you have hired a bunch of brand new parasites to run around trying to destroy the rest of the economy. So even independent of deficits, for me, I would score it as a win, any kind of tax cut, because it improves incentives. This is Econ 101. And because it reduces purchasing power, so the ability to bid on real useful physical resources, men, steel, it transfers that to people who actually do something productive with it. The other point that I just want to mention on the sort of game theory of tariff reciprocity, you do have two equilibriums, of course. One of them is that everybody has roughly zero tariffs, which imperfectly, let's just call that today's situation. And then another situation is where, Trump does 10% on everybody, the Europeans strike back and do 10% on us, and there it ends. So everybody is now funding with equilibrium, or with like an equilibrium, say 10% tariffs. I actually like that world better because I would like the whole world to enjoy the benefits of funding itself by a quasi-sales tax as opposed to an income tax. So if we do get to that horrific world where everybody taxes each other 10%, again, I wouldn't say that's a terrible outcome.
One of the things that a relationship that I've seen connected is between trade deficits and budget deficits. I'm not sure I understand that, but it has to do with the capital account surplus, the accumulation of dollars overseas.
I can explain that.
So maybe, Noah, could you talk about what's happening in international money flows as it pertains to the massive deficits the U.S. runs and how that might get impacted by switching our taxation to a tariff regime? Would that have an impact that we can remotely understand?
So twin deficit theory comes from loanable funds theory, which says that it's all about interest rates. If you have the government borrow a bunch of money, run a deficit, then what happens is that you've increased demand for money, basically. And when you increase the demand for something, you increase the price for the thing. And so you increase the price of money, which is the interest rate, right? And then if you increase the interest rate, then capital will flow into your country. And if capital flows into your country, you get a trade deficit. And so people will be very anxious to like buy American bonds, and this will mean that they'll trade their goods for American bonds, and then we'll get a trade deficit, right? Because we'll be sending out bonds and we'll be taking in goods. That's basically the twin deficit theory. There's not a lot of empirical support for this in the literature, but it's macro empirics, so I don't believe those results. So that's this whole debate, at the end of the day, we could just say, well, it's macroempirics, so I don't believe those results. That's just something we should always say. It's macroempirics. For example, let's talk about some macroempirics. You could look at the Gabriel Chadha-Reich, Owen Zadar, and Eric Zwick wrote a paper. Economists always have the best names, right? I couldn't really stay in economics because my name is Smith. Right, it's Peter's got Saint Ange. You got to have some unusual name.
Gallus,
you need to have Asimoglu. Like Smith. Who remembers Vernon Smith now?
Fukuyama.
And a name that starts with A. This is key to success in economics.
That's right. That's Asimoglu's real secret. Who knows Robinson? Robinson's all the way back at the end of the alphabet. Anyway, so these guys wrote this paper. Chadha-Reich. I can't even pronounce that name. Chadha-Reich et al. Wrote this paper. They say, studying the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the corporate tax cut. They say, let's see, total tangible corporate investment increased by 11%. So that was that's a fairly robust benefit to the economy, right? It said the business tax provisions increased economic growth and wages by less than advertised, with long-run GDP higher by less than 1%. And labor income by less than $1,000 per employee. I believe that less than I believe the result about the increased investment, because the increased investment you see today, whereas the small increase in long run GDP and wages, you need a model to model what happens in the long run, and I don't believe any of those models. So, anyway,
This can be the thing that brings us all together in kumbaya, not
It is.
believing macro
It
models.
is. Noah, you're Austrian. I had no idea all this time.
no, the real problem with Austrian economics, I will tell you the real problem. The real problem is that all of its ideas got co-opted by mainstream economists. So Austrians would come up with this like very long discursive, like Hayek would come up with this long discursive idea of like, how like business cycles are actually driven by changes in like, real productive arrangements and blah, 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 blah. And Ed Prescott came along and said, actually, it's A. And A is calibrated by a univariate AR1 process. And that's what makes recessions. And so the incredibly simplified dork version of Hayek won a Nobel Prize, and the long wordy version of Hayek was forgotten. And so the real problem with Austrian economics is that all of its ideas got incredibly simple. Of course, this happened to Keynes too, right? I mean, like Keynes, it's like Keynes wrote 20 volumes of blah, blah, and Hicks came along and said, it's aggregate AD, here's a number. Quantitative number. And anyway, the thing is that Keynes's idea is probably reduced a bit better to just like, here's a number. So you could have Olivier Blanchard, another one of these great names. Olivier Blanchard, in 2021, he made a very simple, like 2-line new Keynesian model that accurately predicted how much inflation we would get from the COVID relief spending, from the deficit spending that we did. Very accurately predicted all that surge of inflation. It worked really well. Real business cycle models don't work at all. So the thing is that Hayek's ideas were too complex to be boiled down into, but yet they did get boiled down, and they won a Nobel Prize when they got boiled down. Hayek got a Nobel Prize too, so it's okay. But so that was what happened to Austrian economics. It got co-opted. But that's a sidetrack. Anyway, I guess my real point here is that I don't believe in starve the beast theory. I don't believe that adding that having tariffs of 10% and then having Europe do tariffs of 10% on us, which by the way, we get no revenue from their tariffs, they get the revenue. I don't believe that this will actually cause other taxes to go away. I think that maybe you could replace some amount of income taxes with a 10% tariff, but you won't be able to politically. I don't think you'll be able to cut government spending so much that you can replace all of our income taxes with just a 10% tariff, and then have the rest of it be made up by massive, 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 massive cuts in government spending. I don't think people stand for that. I think people just get really, really, really mad. If you look at Trump's how Trump has changed the positions of the Republican Party. In the 2000s, the Republicans were very much for cuts to entitlements, which are the biggest part of government spending by far, right? They were very much for cuts to Medicare, Social Security, et cetera. Now they're not. And if you look at the Republican platform, they say, we don't want to cut any of that. And if you look at Trump has, made a big deal out of not cutting entitlements. I'm a different kind of Republican. I don't cut your entitlements. I'm going to stop immigration, raise tariffs, but I'm not going to cut your entitlements. So Trump is explicitly promising not to starve the beast. And so I'm very skeptical of this political economic idea that Trump is going to be a big spending cutter. That's what I'm skeptical of.
Peter, one other interesting challenge is I was recently looking at, very crudely, average growth rates in the United States. Because partly because we have this ridiculous rhetoric around how consumer spending drives the economy, which is manifestly false if you think about it for 10 minutes, but economists say it anyway. And so I was looking at the fact that the average growth rate, as I could gather it from the St. Louis Fed data, from like 1950 to 1980 was like 4.4%. And from 1980 to today, where our marginal tax rates are substantially lower, is like 2.6 or 2.4.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with even take for granted that taxing something makes people want to do less of it? How do you deal with the just empirical fact that U.S. growth was higher during the period with crazy high income taxes and has been substantially lower in the aftermath of our income taxes coming down below 50% and then below 40% on the highest earners?
Yeah, so there's two reasons. One of them is that when you had 91% statutory income tax, nobody actually paid 91%. Right? There were all kinds of carve-outs. That was the great Reagan bargain. When he came in, he lowered rates to, I think, 28%. And it had, the tax revenue did not decline, 70%, right? There was a relatively modest decrease because what he did at the same time was broaden the base, right? So his premise was, all right, we're going to tax a lower rate, but in return, we're going to take out a lot of loopholes. We're going to tax a broader range of income. And so ultimately, it was less distortionary. But I think so in other words, we're not talking 91 to whatever it is today, 37 or something. We're probably talking 45 to 37 or whatever. The other issue, I think, is that you want to disaggregate those two latter periods. So I don't know the numbers specifically between like the 80s and the 90s in isolation. Noah, you may know these better, but my sense is that they were not worse than the 70s.
Are you talking about in terms of growth, Peter?
In terms of growth, right. Per
The
capita
80s and
growth.
90s were better than the 70s and worse than the 50s and 60s.
Yeah,
There you go.
That's my understanding as well.
Yeah, and but I think the real sort of what's moving, John, the number that you're talking about, where you've got this deceleration over that 40-year period, is what happened really around 2000. So if you look at productivity statistics in 2000, something broke. I don't know what that was. Presumably, it had to do with the response to the dot-com crash, the Enron scandals, and 9/11 all came at the same time. I suspect the previous two. But something broke, and you had like this trend break in productivity where it was something like half the previous 20 years. So what could explain that? One could simply be that you're sort of loading bricks onto the camel's back, and at some point it gave out. The bricks specifically being that if you look at a chart of government regulation, if you look at a chart of bureaucrats employed, if you look at a chart of words in the tax code, right, all of these are related to each other, and it's just straight line up. In 1950, we had something like the tax code was somewhere around 500,000 words. Today it's 10 million words. That was really basically, straight line through Republicans and Democrats because it's coming from the deep state. It's not coming from the political branch. But at any rate, if I had to name a cause, it would be that. They had some kind of cumulative buildup of sort of gunk in the arteries, and then the economy had a heart attack.
You've also got local level things, right? You've got the enormous rise of occupational licensure.
Now is the time to take advantage of the power of gold and silver to grow your wealth, whether you're an experienced investor or new to the game. These precious metals have a long history of being a safe haven for your savings, but they also offer growth potential, making them a wise investment choice. So where does the average investor go to buy gold and silver? That's easy. JM Bullion. JM Bullion is one of the most popular and most trusted precious metals retailers in the nation. We offer a huge selection of gold, silver, platinum, and palladium products that can be delivered to your door in safe, discreet, fully insured packaging. From 1 gram of gold to an entire mint box of silver, JM Bullion offers precious metals to suit every financial goal and budget. No matter your budget, now is the time to start investing in precious metals and start protecting yourself and your savings against these volatile markets. Visit jmbullion.com today to take a look at our wide variety of precious metals, rounds, coins, and bars, and find out how you can turn your savings into gold.
So you go back to 1950, and it feels like laissez-faire for a lot of jobs relative to today, where more than half of all jobs require some kind of government permission slip, stuff like that. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's always, Noah mentioned earlier that, your general approach to any kind of macro statistics should be don't believe it. And in this case, yes, we have, different sort of regimes if we break up averages according to different tax rates, but there's a lot of other things going on in the economy. We have government schools, test scores going down. We have manufacturing going overseas and taking skilled jobs with them, or rather, skilled people die and then they're not replaced by new skilled people. There's a lot of things happening in the economy over that time. But I'd actually love to hear, Noah, if you've got ideas on what broke in 2000, or if my entire model is wrong.
And Noah, how do you understand the difference in sort of, I don't know if the right term would be secular growth or what, but the fact that we're told stories about what's happened to our economy, even when Trump talks about the greatest economy we've had. I looked at just from a pure growth rate perspective, it's not great. So how do you understand what's happened in the States over the past 50 years?
Well, okay, so I think, the short answer is I don't, and no one does. We're all just sort of making guesses. There's people who say, oh, well, we picked the low-hanging fruit of technology, then we had an IT boom, but it only lasted this amount of time and then it petered out. That's like the technologist explanation for stuff. I actually think that a lot of Austrians would not necessarily be, hostile to that idea. The idea that, the available technology is an important input into production. Like if it were physically impossible to make a combustion engine or electricity or any of these things, you would have a poorer economy. And so, so I think that general principle isn't too controversial, but I don't know if I want to just say, it's all just due to these changes in technology. In terms of changes in regulation, I buy that might be part of it. It's very hard to tell because almost all of those pages and pages of regulation stuff no one ever reads. And so if you look at what regulations are actually hurting stuff, it's hard to tell. And some people have tried to associate, different numbers of pages of regulation get written for different industries, right? And so some people have tried to associate just length of the Federal Register, length of the pages of regulation with the performance of different industries, and they've totally failed. Like there's no correlation at all.
Right.
And we don't know why. That doesn't mean regulation's not doing anything, and it doesn't mean regulation's not increasing. It doesn't mean either of those things. But it does mean that we can't easily just identify the impact of this regulation or even the existence of it. Other people like Alex Tabarrok, did this paper where they text mined regulations for like stuff that said like shall not or cannot or whatever, and they also found no effect from that on various industries. So I don't know. I'm very friendly to the idea that regulation is inhibiting growth, but I'm not certain how we tell. I think you can look at specific regulations like NEPA, this procedural requirement that lets NIMBYs sue any developer and adjudicate it through the court system. I'm pretty down on that. I think has a huge impact, and I think we can probably find that. But regulation defined in general, as opposed to these individual regulations, I think is a complex beast, and it's hard to say. What I do think we should do is look at international evidence. So regulations that the United States writes are not the same thing as regulations that Switzerland writes, or that Singapore writes, or these things. Obviously, countries are interrelated through the trading system, but I think that domestic economies are very important, and what you regulate in your terms of your domestic economy is very important. And so I think that when we look at growth in various different countries, can we see the effects of overregulation? I think you can, but it's, you kind of have to squint to see it. Like, I think you can see that European economies have performed generally worse than America. And I think that you can probably trace this to stricter regulation. I would be, so I think that that's probably right. But then when you look at some of these abrupt changes, we saw productivity, growth accelerated in the late 80s and then the 90s. And that acceleration continued through 2004, fairly rapid growth. And then suddenly it petered out really fast everywhere in the world, in the rich world, I'm sorry, not in China, in the rich world, it petered out. Actually, even China, there was an effect, whatever, who cares? So, but in the rich world, everywhere in Europe, in Japan, everywhere, Korea, there was this, up, and then in the mid 2000s, it sort of it doesn't go away, but it just gets worse. And we don't know why. We don't know why this happened. I can't give you a convincing story as to why that suddenly happened. I don't know. But I'm pretty sure it's not because suddenly every country increased its regulation a lot in that year, in 2005. Like, I'm pretty sure that wasn't it. And it wasn't like, it could have been energy related. So we saw a spike in energy prices that took a while to go down. It could have been related to changes in the trading system. It could have been technology related. There's a number of things it could be, but I don't know what it is. And but I'd say it's unlikely that change was due to an abrupt worldwide change in regulation right around the mid 2000s. So I think that we're dealing with a complex thing here, and there's probably multi-cause.
I mean, one of the things that comes to mind in hearing that is fertility, global fertility slowing down. And I very rarely see GDP talked about in per capita terms in these kind of conversations. And we're facing such a fertility transformation happening that I have to imagine that's going to play a larger factor in real growth. I mean, do either of you have thoughts about the relationship there? Just, people are producers. People have a big impact on output. Productivity is a measure of how productive people are. So if we have fewer people, you're going to have lower growth, right?
Yeah, I mean, relatively short term, fewer kids should boost productivity because, kids take a lot of time. Anybody who's got kids.
Fair.
True, they also make you work harder. There's a fatherhood premium. But at any rate, broadly speaking, I think that having fewer kids is normally assumed to be a productivity enhancement. So when they talk about third world countries developing, for example, it's sort of assumed that this demographic transition is going to boost them. Of course, in the long run, it's a problem. You could theoretically have higher productivity because, if Japan's population is shrinking by half, then you've got a bunch of extra capital, even financial capital lying around. So you could make that argument, but of course that then, you sort of takes you to this existential question of, the demise of humanity and such. And then, meanwhile, life expectancies generally have been rising. That's a separate mystery that I would love to hear, Noah, if you have any thoughts on that. But, life expectancies in the West were rising since round about the Peace of Westphalia. And then all of a sudden, like in the past, I think in the U.S. starting in 2009, so immediately after Obamacare, which I do not think is causal for the record, but they essentially leveled off, or I think started declining, was sort of zigzag for a couple of years, and now they're kind of in free fall around the world. This is exciting to some vaccine skeptics, but it did predate the pandemic, and so I don't know why that's happening. That to me is very, very strange. It shouldn't be happening. We've got improved medical technologies. We have just across the board, people live in better houses. Natural disasters don't kill as many people and so on.
Wait, Peter, I have good news for you.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
have good news. In 2022 and 2023, American life expectancy rose and is now at an all-time high.
Did it really?
Yeah.
Aha. Okay.
It's
All
rebounding,
right, good.
yeah.
Okay, so yeah, belay that. All right, so the world is doing great. We got no problem.
This is just going to be brought to you by Steven Pinker. This conversation.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
I'm curious. It sounds like the gap between the two of you on the question of should we abolish the income tax in favor narrowly of tariffs isn't as wide as I was expecting coming into this conversation. That is sort of a technocratic question of like, well, how distortionary would it be? Would it be more or less? Before we move on fully to some other bigger topics, like what should government spending be at? I mean, Noah, is that fair, or are you more forcefully against abolishing the income tax in favor of an increase in excise taxes than it's made sense?
I think that if you were to keep revenue neutral and reduce income taxes and then increase tariffs to match, that would be a loss for America. It would be bad for us, partly because remember that some of the impact of tariffs comes from the retaliation, and we get no revenue from that. So remember, so if we decreased income taxes by, let's say, $500 billion a year of revenue, and increase tariffs by 500 billion of revenue, I think even with zero retaliation from trading partners, that would actually leave us a little bit worse off than before because of the intermediate goods taxation problem. But we'll also get retaliation. And remember, retaliation gets us no revenue. If Europe taxes our goods, that doesn't get the United States Treasury a dime of revenue. And so we will end up paying higher taxes, even higher taxes than that, but then getting no revenue from it. So for a given amount of revenue that we want to raise, tariffs they'll probably be a disaster relative to income taxes, because on top of the slightly increased distortion that you get, you also get this retaliation effect that doesn't net us any revenue at all. And so I think that's why I don't like this idea. But I do think that debating whether or not we could cut government spending is a worthwhile debate to have, sort of, apart from the question of how much government should we fund, is a good debate apart from the question of how should we fund whatever amount of government we fund. And of course, if you assume these political economic feedback effects where having this kind of tax makes it harder to raise government spending and blah, 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 which I'm not at all sure of, then you could get a relationship between these two questions and then you can't separate them. But I like to separate them in my mind and think about those, even if in reality maybe there are some of those effects, political economic effects that relate them. Does that
I
make
have one
sense?
follow-up for you, Noah, and then Peter, I'll turn it over for you, which is, it appears, my understanding is that the United States has the most progressive tax system in the OECD, that we fund our government on the backs of the wealthiest Americans more than every rich country. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes. That's just our tax system, though. If you look at our tax and spending system combined, it's like sort of, at the 25th percentile of progressiveness. So it's actually a little bit less progressive than average because, remember, the European countries are spending all that money on the board. But if you look at just our tax system itself, we're the most progressive.
And so one argument in favor of this tax system really does matter for the size of government structurally would be to compare the U.S. and Europe in terms of the size of European welfare states and their reliance on regressive VAT taxes that hit everybody much harder than our very progressive, very tax the soak the rich system. Or at least there's an argument for that, right? Do you think that that's a viable argument, that that's an example of two tax regimes, one of which funds and enables bigger government than another?
Me? This is a question for me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, so I don't know. In practice, our taxes are progressive, but the income tax specifically is less progressive than people think because rich people dodge a lot of it. Mm-hmm. And so we raise the rates, and then rich people spend money and dodge it, and they lower their effective rate. So it's not flat, but it's a pretty gradual increase. We have closer to a flat tax in terms of income tax. The real progressiveness in our system comes from things like capital gains taxes. That's where the real progressiveness comes from in our system, which, as you mentioned, is very high. We have very high progressiveness, and corporate tax also. And so we have, but income tax is less progressive than people think. Poor people don't pay income tax, but then rich people don't pay as high income tax as people think because they dodge it. Mm-hmm. And payroll taxes are actually not very progressive at all. So the stuff that funds Social Security and Medicare, the payroll tax, although its ability to fund Social Security and Medicare will run out soon unless we cut benefits, but that's another story. But the taxes that fund Social Security and Medicare are actually not very progressive.
But they're being put in my account, Noah. They're being put in my savings account.
They're being put in your savings account. That's
what the government told me going back to the 30s.
The income tax primarily,
right.
Yes. Anyway, but I guess the idea that income tax being progressive means that more of the tax is paid by rich people, and therefore it's easier to raise taxes because there aren't that many rich people to vote. That's the idea. That is an idea. Mitt Romney said this famously. People laughed at him for it, but he did say it. I'm not sure whether that's true. I think that even if you had a flat tax, rich people would pay most of the taxes, right? Because even if you had a flat tax, it's proportional to income, right? And so rich people would still be paying, their share of the taxes, which is larger share. And so you'd still have this pattern where rich people pay a lot of the tax, and you'd still have this thing where there's not that many rich people to vote the tax down. There's some very, very like abstruse economic game theory stuff about taxing rich people and whether you can actually do that. There's an interesting idea, which is that rich people can move some of their money overseas and avoid taxation. And that's become a lot easier than it used to be. And that's one way that rich people avoid taxes. And that's one reason why taxing the rich is actually hard. It's harder than people think. But by that same token, it's less distortionary than people think. The big worry of the income tax is that people stop working. Rich people in America work harder than they've ever worked before. Like rich people in America work, and it's kind of crazy. Like there's this idea, popular idea, that rich people are mostly like these top hat wearing, Gilded Age barons sitting back smoking a cigar, just collecting money collecting rent on their capital. They're not. Rich people are working their butts off at their own businesses. Like you have a few people with inherited wealth who are idle rich and whatever, but most people or who sell their company and then become a bum for a while, but they worked hard before they sold the company. And so rich people work really hard in America, really, really hard. And so income tax can't be that distortionary because all the rich people work real hard. In fact, harder than they do in other countries. But also they dodge taxes. And so the waste of income tax is the money that the rich people spend on dodging taxes. The tax accountant fees are the waste, right? That's the waste that they could be plowing into, investment, right? Growing the economy. The waste are fancy accountants to help you dodge taxes. Those are the people with the bullshit jobs, I guess, because if we didn't have taxes, those people would be out of a job because there wouldn't be taxes to dodge. So I don't know.
Not insignificant amount of savings there.
It would be a modest amount of savings. I think income taxes are distortionary, but they're not as distortionary as you might worry about until you get to the very high rates, at which point they do. But partly because they're fairly easy to dodge, they're actually not that distortionary of a tax. Probably not that much worse than a sales tax, honestly. Like, yes, there's a little bit of delta there, but I don't think you're going to get a dramatic increase in economic growth from switching to an income tax to sales tax just because everyone's dodging the income tax already.
Peter, any final words on the tax before we talk about spending? After all, Milton Friedman said if you want to understand the burden of government, don't look at the taxes, look at the spending.
Look at the spending. Yeah, so just a couple comments on that. So, right, I would agree this is something that I've complained about, that when you raise taxes, you're not hitting the billionaires. Billionaires have very, very good, they have good tax lawyers, they have good accountants, they have good lobbyists. They're not actually going to pay it. Empirically, did a back of the envelope years ago just to look at how much taxes are paid by billionaires, and it's something like 25% is where it tops out. Past 25%, they will find a way. You cannot tax billionaires more than 25%. Nature finds a way. But that is specifically, a big part of that, I think, is exactly the distortion with taxes in the first place, is kind of point one. So a big way that they dodge taxes is by moving money into suboptimal uses where, they're not building a factory, they've got it in a trust with if I knew better, I would be a tax accountant. The other issue is that I think that top tax rates, right? So if you're talking 35% in the U.S., for example, hits, I think, about $500,000 for a married couple, less than that if you're single. There are a lot of small businesses that could clear that kind of money, right? So a mom and pop restaurant, a car detailer, a lawn care company, a plumber, right? There are a lot of small businesses who are going to pay that. They're not at the level where they're going to have an on-call tax accountant on speed dial. But so I think functionally what ends up happening is that when you jack rates up, you are stripping the middle class. And in the process, you are knocking out some of the rungs in the middle of the ladder. The billionaires, for sure, they're going to ignore it. They're never, ever going to pay it. Fine. And they're going to keep doing whatever they were doing before, right? If the tax rate goes up 4%, Elon Musk will change absolutely nothing in how he leads his life. However, plumbers, they're going to hire more people. Are people going to make investments that, might be riskier? If you lose your investment, you lose, right? The government doesn't chip in. If you win and that's now being trimmed, then that can change people's behavior. So I do think that it's still enormously distortionary, even along the way. The other that I wanted to mention is also that if we're talking about sort of the impact of, the size of the welfare state, a lot of that has to do with details, right? So for example, there's something called the poverty trap, where you might go on welfare, and if you start trying to earn an income, your welfare will be stripped off pretty much as fast as your income grows. So in other words, why get a job once you're on welfare? You're just going to be handing it over to the government. On the other hand, in the U.S., we also have something called the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, billed as a negative income tax. So these have very, very different incentive impacts. And so when we're looking at Europe, for example, like there's this lively debate about whether Scandinavia is socialist or is it free market. And there's a lot of devils hiding in that detail where, if you just look at GDP as a share of the economy or even social spending, right? The question is, how are those programs structured? This is fascinating if you're trying to engineer a country. Like, if you're Singapore and you're trying to figure out, like, you've got civil servants who actually care, then all these details are really fascinating. But it's tricky in terms of trying to correlate things like economic growth and the size of government. You've got to dig in deep, and there are not enough eyes on these kinds of questions to really get to it.
So, last question on the tax front. Let's imagine that we have a benevolent dictatorship opportunity, and you can design the perfect tax system without regard for what is politically feasible. And the only option I'll take off the table for now is strangling the government and ushering in an anarcho-capitalist state in which taxes are zero. I'm sorry, Peter, we can get to that in the next part of the conversation. But if you had your way and you had to raise roughly the revenue that we need to fund the government as it currently exists, what would be your ideal system in 2 minutes or less? Noah, why don't you start?
Well, I think that I would use a lot more property tax and land tax than we currently do. I'm pretty Georgist in this sense because land isn't going anywhere. I recognize that it's difficult to separate the value of land from the value of improvements of the land, but I also think that, those differences can sometimes be second-order problems. I think that a VAT would be a good idea that we don't do. We could shift corporate income tax to a VAT, and that would help a lot. I think it would encourage investment. It would even out some trade problems that we have with unfair treatment of imports and export and domestic production. I think, switching corporate income tax to VAT would be good. I think that I think income tax is fine where it is. I don't have a problem with it as it is. I think that shifting corporate income tax to VAT would be kind of the biggest change I'd make, and increased reliance on property tax. So states should just not even have income taxes. They should just so we can abolish the state income tax. Let's have a compromise. We'll leave the federal income tax, but we'll abolish state income taxes and then replace them with property taxes. I say this as a Californian who does not own a home, so I'm talking my own book here. But I will say that when I pay income taxes, this will segue into the spending part of the discussion. When I pay income taxes to the federal government, I'm very happy to pay that. I happily pay those income taxes, and I'm thinking, wow, old people will get to eat because of this, and then our army will get to defend our country against the evil empires that would take all our stuff, and that's good. I support that. I want all those things. But then when I pay state income taxes, I'm like, someone is going to waste this on a nonprofit. Someone is going to hand this, someone is going to build a high-speed rail that never gets built ever. And we just spent all these billions of dollars and it doesn't exist. So I'm living in California. You see how much money the state wastes. I think I love my federal income taxes and I resent my state income taxes. So replace them with property tax, please. Anyway.
As a Californian, I don't know how to... What political animal you've painted yourself as there is hilarious. Peter, how about you? Your ideal.
Okay, my ideal.
You have a blank slate. Noah, you get dinged for being too moderate with your blank slate opportunity. Peter, hopefully you can be more radical.
Oh wait, I had a blank slate. Okay, I was
Blank
just
slate.
okay.
No, a blank slate. You're keeping things. This, keep that. Really?
Go-
You
Yeah, we'll
no,
just
no,
do land
no.
tax and VAT for everything.
Blank
Land
slate.
tax, VAT, and capital gains tax for everything.
Okay, there we now we're talking.
All right,
Land
there you go.
tax, VAT.
All right.
Land tax, VAT, capital gains tax. There you go.
No income tax in a perfect.
Yeah, we'll
perfect-
abolish the income tax. We'll place it with VAT, land tax, but we'll also raise capital gains taxes for the progressive element. Because that's actually our most progressive tax.
Peter, blank slate.
All right. Noah, consider the possibility that your anti-state tax and pro-federal tax, because you live in California, you can actually see the waste, right? Like if you move to D.C. after a year and a half, you may feel the same way, and then we'd be on the same page. Okay, dream tax. Number one, head tax. If you can't pay it, you pick up trash off of the beach. That is not politically feasible, and so the next best thing that is somewhat feasible would be a across-the-board sales tax. If you have to tax something with, I don't think you have to tax much. I think we could probably sustain the government on something like $200 to $300 billion a year, which would be almost in the size of our economy. That'd be less than 1% of GDP. But anyway, if you had to tax, I would say sales tax, punish consumption, do not punish production.
All right, so that I think fairly concludes our tax conversation. Let's talk about the spending side of the ledger. Take about 3 minutes apiece. Peter, you start with what should the government's role be? What should it be doing with the money it takes, if at all?
Okay, so without getting into anarcho-capitalism and the Icelandic option, where you could choose your chief. Okay, so without getting into that, more or less Milton Friedman, so the night watchman, meaning that you've got defense, justice, defense, justice, treasury, and state, which ironically are the only four departments that are actually authorized in the Constitution. They are delegated powers. 10th Amendment, everything else is unconstitutional, which is also known as illegal for the government to do. So both the Constitution and I agree, those should be the only four departments. I would also argue that the vast majority of what all of those departments do is also not delegated, such as invading Iraq. And so those should be removed. And so when you boil those down to what is actually authorized and what is actually useful, 200 to 300 billion a year.
And what comes of grandma? Back to eating cat food?
But poor grandma. Grandma can get a job.
I just witnessed a murder. Oh my God! Zero Hedge just murdered. Zero Hedge just murdered Austrian economics. I did not expect that.
Okay,
I am as Austrian as they come, but I have to be fair in my moderation. So
no, for sure. Okay, so the serious answer, assuming grandma does not have a job available to her that she would enjoy doing, is that if you look at the safety net before the government screwed it up, you had private organizations, you had an immense amount of resources. They generally went through either some sort of occupational association like the Fishermen's Association or the Shoemakers Brotherhood or something like this, or they went through churches. And the key point is that they were conditional, meaning that if you were grandma who was bedridden, then they would give you a free house. They wouldn't give it to you. You would be able to live in a house. So churches generally built houses nearby where impoverished parishioners could live. On the other hand, if you were a meth addict and you went to the priest and wanted to get a free house, he would say, well, yes, you can sleep in the church basement, but tell me, how are you turning your life around? Okay, there would be monitoring, there would be feedback. If you were turning your life around, then you would continue to get this, sort of hand up until you get back on your feet. Now, there's a paper by Russ Roberts at George Mason where he looked at what happened once government got into this gig. Of course, government got into it because it's good PR. Okay, for the same reason that the mafia does kind things for people. They fund the festival of, our Senora of whatever. For the same reason the government wants to capture anything that looks good, right? Using the stolen goods that it took in taxes. So once the government got involved, now the government, they don't care, right? So realistically, a government employee does not care the way that, Father Mulhaney cares about whether you're getting yourself back on your feet. Secondly, just the nature of government programs tends to be that it is unconditional. It's easier to administer. You have less potential for corruption, which is endemic to government. It's nearly universal in government work. And so the end result is that now, if you're on meth, you stay on meth, baby, whatever you need. I mean, you guys have both lived in California. You see the sort of logical conclusion.
I have not
of that.
lived in California, Peter. How dare you?
I thought you lived in California.
No.
Oh man, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean
I
it
live in
that way,
Texas.
dude. I didn't mean it like that, man. Right. So the short answer.
Wait, hold
is-
on. Pause. John, you are currently in Texas, but you're from California?
I am from Philadelphia. I worked in New York City, and now I live in Texas.
Now you live in Texas. Great. Where do you live in Texas?
Austin, Texas.
All right. Well, I am a Texan, and I salute the best state.
And I'm a Philadelphian, so John, you are the great unifier in this conversation.
So just to get you back on track, Peter, before we shift gears to Noah, government, everything it touches turns to shit. Every charity it takes over, it turns into a moral hazard producing wasteland of despair and destruction. Anything else?
Yeah, beautifully put. Absolutely.
All right, Noah. Why are we libertarian crazy people? What is the proper role of government according to you, you wonderfully moderate man?
I think that the most important thing that government does is provide public goods. So there's stuff that markets won't do on their own, just charity won't do on its own, like national defense, for example, is a big one. One of the very first blog posts I ever wrote was something about the idea of philosophical libertarianism called the Tamerlane Principle. And the Tamerlane Principle is that, you know who Tamerlane was, right? He's Timur from Uzbekistan, modern day Uzbekistan. He was a conqueror. And sometimes he'd just ride up with his army and just turn your whole country into a pyramid of skulls and take all your stuff. And I feel that this is very inimical to freedom. When you get your country turned into a pyramid of skulls and all your stuff taken, you're less free than before, primarily because you're a skull. And so this is very, very deleterious to human freedom. And yet when you look at most of history is just a bunch of guys like this doing that, right? And they weren't stopped by... There were plenty of guys saying, hey, man, you shouldn't do that, man. Like, there were people saying that to Timur and to Genghis Khan, to any conqueror in the world, Alexander, whoever you want, right? There were people saying this, but then it didn't work. It didn't stop them. There's like, yeah, I should, plus I kill you. And then, like, it didn't work. And so the only thing that eventually sort of stabilized the world was when countries started getting really good local defense. And you started having countries that could defend themselves against Tamerlanes, right? They would spend money on defense, and then when Tamerlane would come, they'd be like, pow, 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 and shoot Tamerlane, right? And national defense became this sort of extremely important instrument of human freedom. It was not, the Mongols and the Tatars and the various other conquerors of the world were never stopped by like a homesteader with a shotgun. Much as I, as a Texan, love the idea of a homesteader with a shotgun single-handedly stopping an invading army, and have watched many science fiction shows where this happens, I do think it's realistic. I think realistically you need collective defense, national defense, and with some sort of collective action. You have a collective action problem. Whether you solve that via our traditional fiscal system with we tax people, we pay a professional army, blah, 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 or whether you have some other kind of collective defense arrangement, which I could write down in an economic theory book, it really ultimately boils down to the same thing, which is if we don't collectively defend ourselves today, we lose our freedoms tomorrow. And I think that this idea has been radically driven home in recent years. So you see Estonia, one of the most libertarian societies on earth, very low taxes, been growing great, been really, very, very free economically, right at the top of those rankings along with Singapore. And Estonia is this small country under massive, massive threat from Russia. And now we know that Vladimir Putin is willing and able to conquer neighboring countries just because he feels like it. And then how free do they become after? How free do you think Ukraine will be if and when Vladimir Putin finally conquers it? It will not be very free at all. Russia's not a free place economically or socially. And so if you want to ensure your freedom not just today, but tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, then you've got to defend yourself today. You've got to have public goods. And not only that, it's not just defense itself. It's not just buying some drones and missiles. It's doing whatever you need to do to make the richest possible economy in order to fund national defense in the future. In order to be able to fund national defense, because when you look at a country like Poland or a country like South Korea that has grown like gangbusters in recent decades, those countries are so much better able to defend themselves against outside attack than they were when they were poor. And one reason Ukraine was so weak is because it was poor. And Poland is a lot richer than Ukraine. It'll be a lot harder of a nut for Putin to crack. And it's because they grew. Now, some growth comes from libertarian stuff. Some growth will come from deregulation, tax cuts, et cetera. You can get some growth that way. But also I think that, it's pretty clear that a lot of public goods contribute to the wealth of nations. Infrastructure, often pretty much like you don't see countries with really good private road systems. It just doesn't exist. All the really good road systems.
2/3 of its roads were privately operated. Am I misunderstood?
Pardon?
Doesn't Sweden have 2/3 of its road system operated privately?
Yeah, but government built them.
Government's great at rolling flat concrete, Noah. Excellent at it.
Yeah. But government, it's really the land acquisition. It's the coordination problem of solving land holdouts you do with eminent domain. You can do systems where you have more government will do the land acquisition for a competitive bidding association of private firms and to build infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. You can do that, but what you have with infrastructure is an obvious network effect externality, which is that's equivalent to a public good. But when you have...
Noah, let me interrupt for 1 sec.
I'll explain why roads are public good. Okay.
You've laid out an excellent case for America as it existed in 1910. But we have a much bigger government than that.
Understood.
So do you believe that the government as it is constituted now, which is overwhelming, I think close to half of every dollar that goes into D.C. comes back out to give to somebody else in the form of something that looks like a Ponzi scheme / poorly managed healthcare system? So
I prefer the word
insurance
transfer.
program. It's like an insurance
transfer
program.
payment.
It's a transfer payment. That's what the economists would say. But, right? So that's most of the government now. It's not really a public good so much as something like an insurance program.
I agree with you. Yes, that's right.
So do you, are you okay with that? How do you philosophically contend with government in America as it exists in 2024?
I believe that government has a right to do this. We're talking about redistribution. We're talking about in-kind redistribution. You redistribute from taxpayers to recipients of old age health care. Does the government have a philosophical right to do this? I believe yes, we do. The justification is not the same as the justification for public goods. But what's the moral justification for redistribution? The idea is that, society really, really demands it. And for us to stop society from doing that would require things that I really don't want. It's you can stop redistribution from going past a certain point. But to get rid of all redistribution, if you look at the costs of that in terms of institutionally what you have to do, it's something along the lines of shoot a lot of people who demand redistribution, or get rid of democracy, because one person, one vote will lead to redistribution through the Mitt Romney mechanism, right? Poor people will vote themselves higher benefits. Okay, fine. There's a lot of them. They can vote. And
two wolves will outvote the sheep in the crowd of three.
Two wolves will outvote the sheep, right? The poor, super rich sheep. The things required to stop redistribution from happening are brutal. It involves abrogating democracy and shooting mobs that riot. And
but
so Peter,
as far as I know,
redistribution is not in the Constitution, right?
No, it's not. It's not.
So
Not in the
what you're
Constitution.
describing would be ignoring the Constitution. So no, you would not need to shoot people in the street. You would need to.
Well, I don't know
enforce
that it's
the
against.
Amendment.
No, I don't think it's against the Constitution.
It's not delegated. It's not a delegated power.
No, but I don't. I think that the Constitution
You're
does
familiar
not.
with the text of the 10th Amendment, though, right?
Yeah, the Constitution does not forbid things that it does not delegate.
Oh, no, it very much does. The Constitution is a list of things that the government is allowed to do, and it's an exhausted list, as described in the 10th Amendment. Any powers not delegated are reserved for the states, comma, or for the people. No, a Constitution is an exhaustive list of what the government is legally allowed to do. You can advocate
I
changing
think that's
the
wrong.
Constitution.
No, I don't think that's right. I think that as
just read the
current
10th
Supreme
Amendment.
Court precedent stands,
Well-
that's not how we view it.
Well, let's just set that aside. We deeply disagree on that. But
I'm
the
not a
broader
legal scholar.
question-
I'm just saying that's the Supreme Court appears to have given the government power to redistribute. Appears to have agreed that the Constitution allows redistribution.
The Supreme Court is called the Constitution at Exile. So what happened is FDR threatened to pack the court. The court decided that this was not the time to have that fight because the government was overwhelmingly dominated by Democrats because Hoover screwed up so bad. So they set the fight aside for another time and let New Deal things pass. They let a bunch of stuff pass, which was not delegated in the Constitution, and they figured we will fight another day. That fight is still unresolved. The 10th Amendment is extraordinarily clear. If it is not delegated in the Constitution, it is forbidden to the central government. The Constitution is not what government's allowed to do. It's what government, it's not a question of forbidding the government from doing things. It is an exhaustive list of what is allowed to do. It's not the Constitution can't do it. States can do it. States can do all kinds of wacky things. States can redistribute. They can, each state has its own constitution. I don't know all 50 constitutions. The federal government is absolutely not allowed to do that under the Constitution. If you wanted to get rid of it, you do not have to shoot people. You just simply have to have a Supreme Court that has the balls to enforce the 10th Amendment as it's very clearly written. It is one sentence long.
But Peter, I think maybe the point that Noah's trying to make about the shooting people isn't whether it's legal or not, but that these giant transfer schemes are deeply embedded in our culture. My parents, your parents have made the decisions about their livelihoods, taking them into consideration. And if we did have someone come along and say, hey, this isn't in the Constitution, I'm pulling the plug, there would be an uprising, the likes of which
right.
we would never, look, we had people burning down cities because one guy got killed by a police officer. So taking all of the welfare state away would, right? So if contend with the spirit of what Noah is saying with regard to the sort of political demand for there being big government.
Yeah, John, let me expand on that. If you took away the Supreme Court decision that if you reverse the Supreme Court decision and went with the idea that all powers of the government must be explicitly in the Constitution, people would definitely vote for a constitutional amendment to allow the government to keep doing many of the things they wanted to keep doing. The Constitution is amendable, and we can, people will just vote. And they'll vote for an amendment. Pardon?
Well, states say, well,
you can. No, I'm saying like you can just amend the Constitution to explicitly say income tax redistribution, yes, allowed, good, government.
Just for sure.
Real quick on that.
And
Peter.
people do that. The point is that
this is the history of the income tax, as I understand it, is that the amendment of that made the income tax legal in the United States. I think it's the 16th Amendment.
Yep.
It was put forward. I was reading about this right before this, so I could have some of this stuff in foreground. As I read it, the motivation behind the 16th Amendment being put forward was because anti-income tax folks in the Congress believed that the public would roundly reject it and that it would go down and put this idea to bed, and instead the states ratified it. And so it is an example. Again, I'm not for this. I'm not happy about this, but it is an example of what Noah is describing of the political will, right? So,
yeah, and this is something that's going to come up. We were talking earlier about the kinds of spending cuts that, Doge, for example, is. I think Elon Musk floated $2 trillion, which is a chunk of change, and you would certainly need to dig into mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is often represented, I think cynically, as if it's all like Social Security and Medicare, which are they're probably the two most popular programs out of anything that government spends money on, probably even more popular than the military. But actually, there's a whole ton in there that you wouldn't expect. So there's food stamps, for example. There's government pensions. A lot of those pensions are extraordinarily generous. There's a lot of stuff in there that could be cut. But sort of, in terms of the broader question, I think there are two types of sort of transfer programs that we have. One of them, people feel that they have paid into, so specifically Social Security and Medicare. Those are the two biggest ones. That, I think, is philosophically it's complicated. I've generally advocated that you do not simply cancel those programs because people have paid for them. And generally speaking, if you look at the opportunity cost of their money, in other words, if they had invested it in a mixed portfolio of stocks and bonds, already about half of it has been stolen in the first place. And so that, to me, if you just ended those programs together, I think that would clearly be an injustice. You'd be robbing those people. So an absolute minimum, you could in theory issue bonds to people. You could do sort of transitional helpful things like, anybody can opt out of the system, in which case it would be, prudent for people under age 40 in general to drop out. And so you can kind of wind down the programs that way. But anyway, so those I think have to be compensated if you're going to change the programs. And then there's another category of things that are not paid for. They just come out of general revenue. So that includes Medicaid, food stamps. Generally, the welfare state, broadly speaking, has not been paid by the putative recipient. Those I think are a little bit more those are a little bit simpler. I think that you could transfer those over to the states. At that point, you would get the magic of competition between states. People could vote with their feet. People are already doing that. We have almost no homeless people in Florida because they've all moved to California. And so that acts as a sort of natural break on how much governments are going to spend.
Yeah, no. What is your response to the notion that a lot of what is currently done by the federal government could and perhaps should be done by the state governments? That we should make much more fuller use of this unique federalism structure that I think is part of what has made the United States such a potent force. Competition, the laboratory of 50 different democracies.
Well, I think that there are a lot of cases in which I think, yeah, absolutely, competition between the states is good. You're right. But in terms of like redistribution and welfare spending, I think that to a large degree, people demand federal welfare spending so that you don't have, for example, a race to the bottom between states where all the states try to compete to send the homeless people somewhere else or whatever, right? That pisses people off. And so they vote for a federal welfare state. And you see that people support a federal welfare state all around the world, like even in Singapore, right? There's pretty much, Singapore has a smaller federal welfare state than we do, but you have a house from, always in Singapore. You have a house, you have a pension. It doesn't have, it got a welfare state, maybe a smaller one than we do, but most countries have larger welfare states than we do. We have a relatively small welfare. We have a decent welfare state.
Most European countries do. Most countries on Earth.
Most rich countries.
Yeah.
But also Asian countries too. I think Korea's is a little bit smaller.
You can play games with
Japan's a little bit bigger.
Exactly. So you can play games with rich countries because Europe is all broken up into countries, and so they get more votes. And if you sort of put rich countries into baskets,
Canada, Australia, all those Anglosphere countries.
Debate. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that we see this very robust pattern that essentially never gets broken. Singapore is the only slight violation, but even then doesn't really violate it. You see this pattern where when countries get rich, they get big welfare states. And that to me suggests that people want this. And telling people, no, you can't have this because I made a law saying you can't have this. So you can't have this is playing with fire. And John's right. Like people vote, and people voted to have the income tax, and they also riot, and you can shoot the rioters, and then what kind of society do you get when you shoot the rioters? Like, many of the actual actions required to have an economically libertarian state, economic policy will result in a politically, culturally, and socially non-libertarian society that I don't really like. I don't want to live in, some place that has perfect economic freedom, but where there's guards with machine guns on every corner, making sure that you don't riot or whatever because you're mad that you're poor. And like, I don't want to live there. And I know those are,
Well,
like,
so,
like John
okay,
said,
so-
that's less outlandish than he thought. If you were there in summer 2020, people do riot. People rioted over stuff they saw on social media. Like, people would riot, riots were worse in the 60s.
Yes.
And our modern welfare state was LBJ explicitly said that the Great Society, the modern welfare state, was to reduce rioting in America.
And it worked like a charm, didn't it? Right. So, in other words,
worked
welfare
fairly well.
increases rioting, which is a good
Well, we've
data
had a
point.
lot less rioting since we've had that welfare state. In 2020 we did have rioting, but I think only 12 people were killed nationwide, which was less than your average one riot in the 60s. So there, I do think you've seen.
The riots in the 60s came after the Great Society. The data point goes the exact opposite direction. As soon as LBJ ramped up the so-called Great Society, the welfare state, that's when the riots started. Now, I don't think it's causal. I think what actually happened is that there was a tacit understanding from certain politicians that the riots were useful because they gave them political momentum to demand various sort of payoffs that they could use by votes, and that they could also scrape off some of it for their own. We saw this in 2020. If you look at the differential response to the BLM riots that were they were in dozens of cities that were burning entire cities. People would get a slap on the wrist. Then if you compare that to J6. So I think that the riots have been a policy choice because they're politically useful. Moreover, if we're positing that when 51% of the population wants something, then we have to shoot them if we want to change it, Trump just won an election. And I think it's fair to, he hasn't commented on, say, giving welfare to able-bodied people, but I think it's probably safe to say he probably wants to reduce it. So now you advocating continuation of the current welfare state that I think by all accounts does give a fair amount of money to able-bodied people. So you're advocating that continuation. You're not trying to shoot people. Like, people don't shoot each other. There's elections. 51% say this, 51% say that. It is not inherent to the welfare system that if you try to change it, you're going to have to shoot people. That's insane.
I
Maybe.
think Noah, you are being a little hyperbolic there, are you not? To say that
You're right. I am because I'm also being a little hyperbolic with Tamerlane, who doesn't exist anymore.
Well, let me
But
give you an example for that.
I'm trying to illustrate a
point.
principle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one
I think
could-
if you did go back to having grandma eat cat food and having people
I didn't
just
say grandma eats cat food. I said that you restore the pre-government welfare state that was much richer and much more effective. Grandma never ate cat food in this country. Right. Ever since the founding, people helped each other all the time. There's this government myth that only government does good things and that regular people are like just evil, trying to kill each other. That's not how people are. You look at North Carolina, when the government was not there, people helped each other. Grandma will not eat cat food either way. What we will have is a much larger economy because remember that every $1 in taxes kills $3 in the economy. When you transfer $1 from one person who earned it to another person that didn't, you are destroying a massive amount of resources. So in my world, you have private sector charity, which does not have incentive destroying effects because the people enjoy giving it in the first place, unlike paying taxes. Meanwhile, the economy is much bigger, so you have a much smaller amount of people who need help. It is inconceivable in my economy that anybody would look for welfare if they're able-bodied. There'd be jobs galore.
So Noah, I want to posit two challenges to the premise, because I want to state what I think is your premise, and tell me if you think this is a fair characterization. It's a little meta. American society, for all its problems, is pretty good. So is most of the rich world. And it is the product of a set of institutions that have emerged through popular will and working it out in our politics, such that capitalism plus welfare state is kind of the thing that seems to work, and we all kind of like it, even despite the grumbly libertarians that want to take us to a different place. But is that a fair characterization of what you're saying when you say we're rich, we have this stuff, people will go crazy if we take it away, so we should probably keep it?
Well, yeah, I think you can make important arguments about shrinking or growing the welfare state on the margin. And I think there's probably lots of room to shrink or grow the welfare state on the margin without people rioting in the street and without prompting that big of an electoral backlash. I think if you got rid of Social Security and Medicare, you'd have a big electoral backlash, and that's why Trump has said he's not going to do it. And the Republican Party has said they're not going to do it. They're not going to get rid of Social Security and Medicare. They like those entitlements. They're not going to give them up.
So I want to point to two things
that's just electoral.
Yeah.
That's electoral. That's not people rioting in the streets. I think to get people to riot in the streets over poverty, you'd need incredibly extreme measures, which I don't think we're going to have realistically. I think it's not a realistic outcome. I think realistically, I think that you could have cuts in entitlements that are really big and provoke an electoral backlash against Republicans, and then Democrats come in and make entitlements really big. I think you could have that. That's realistic. That's a realistic kind of thing I can imagine happening tomorrow. Well, or whenever there's the next election. And so I think to some degree, you had people elect Biden in 2020. Biden, increased the welfare state in some ways. People elected, Bush and Obama both increased the welfare state. Oh, Bush increased the welfare state by more than Obama. He increased food stamps a ton. Bush did massive amounts to eliminate homelessness at the federal level through the Housing First program. We just reduced homelessness by a lot. Bush was a compassionate conservative. Everyone hates him because of the Iraq War and the financial crisis. He messed up these big things, but he was a compassionate conservative in that he increased the welfare state. Obama increased the welfare state more, and then Biden increased the welfare state even more. Trump slightly did increase the welfare state. So we haven't had a president who cut the welfare state since Bill Clinton.
So, and there wasn't any riots. Well, I mean,
the Clinton time, there was not any riots. That's right. There's absolutely scope to cut the welfare state on the margins. Now, I will say this though: Bill Clinton cut welfare, but he increased the EITC, which you can call a kind of welfare state, which actually canceled out pretty much all of the cuts in welfare from killing AFDC, TANF, which didn't die. It just shrunk till you can drown in a bathtub. But then but Clinton didn't really cut the welfare state that much. Reagan didn't really cut it either. No one has severely cut the welfare state within our lifetimes. And the federal welfare state, it hasn't really happened. People keep voting for people who increase the welfare state. Even if you want to cut the welfare state, I think it's a little unrealistic to want to abolish the federal welfare state in terms of electoral stuff. Anyway, we'll wait for Peter to come back. I do have to go at 3, by the way, so I do have a hard stop, even if we can't get Peter back.
I will, on behalf of Peter, wear my most libertarian hat and posit a different criticism of your view or of the state. It comes in two forms. Your first part of your argument in favor of government role, a strong government role for the provision of public goods, especially around defense. One could argue that all we did was take Genghis Khan types and put them in charge of the most destructive militaries the world has ever seen, and that's called the 20th century. So what we did with government is say, hey, Genghis Khan types, now we'll give you faux legitimacy so you can murder 100 million people under fascism and communism and sort of various forms of collective tribal nonsense that have been resurrected in the 20th century to disastrous effects. So the net benefit on the robust government military force, taking into account the 20th century's death count, might not be so great. So that's part one. I'd be curious how you respond to that. It's philosophical and it's hyperbolic, and I understand. The second one I think is even more difficult, and that is that human beings seem to be prone towards moral hazard, and when you crowd out a more responsible, more incentives-aligned welfare kind of system, one that actually punishes bad behavior and instead creates one that not only actively encourages it, but often advertises and actively seeks to break the social things that keep people on the straight and narrow, as the Great Society did. There's been an active attempt to go into communities where adoption of the welfare programs was low and they were poor, but they had pride, and they said, I'm not going to be on the dole. And government actively said, no, we're going to destigmatize being on the dole so that you'll adopt our program. And what it seems to me is, along a lot of dimensions, American culture is deeply, profoundly sick. And government has played a substantial role in making us worse people, more dependent people, less resilient people. You look at suicidality, you look at mental health collapse, especially among Gen Z, and you see a lot of indicators, and physical health, and you look at a lot of indicators and say, this giant government has made us a worse society while claiming to protect us from ourselves. I think that's at least a legitimate argument. I'd be curious how you, Peter, let's start with you, Peter. How do you respond to that? And then Noah can
welcome
take
back.
it in mind.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
You have to go in 5 minutes, but welcome back.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. So one of my favorite metaphors, I think, for government is a lion. Okay. Female lions do all the work. They hunt. They take care of the young. They do everything useful. Male lions sit around and sleep all day. When the female, they don't kill stuff. When the female kills something, the male comes over and steals the food. He will bite them because he eats first. And then he eats till he's done and he goes back to sleep. Absolutely useless, pathetic, embarrassing. They have one use, which is when another male lion comes, they have to go to war and kill or be killed because the other male lion will eat all the babies. So that is their only use. So to me, that is precisely what a government is. We can't have anarcho-capitalism because some government will roll in there and take it over. We saw this with Tonga, with the Republic of Minerva. A bunch of hippies wanted to create a community and they established an independent island. And like the next day, this island Republic of Tonga shows up with like 5 guys in a boat, and that's the end of it. All right, so that, to me, that's the only purpose of the government, is to protect us, mostly from overseas. But as long as we have it, you can make an argument for also having a justice function, a police function, and so on. Those should generally, in my opinion, be as low as possible. They should be as close to the people as possible so that they are representing those people. I grew up in Philadelphia, and there were a lot of crimes that were crimes on paper, but not really crimes, because the cop's mom went to church with your mom, and they weren't going to harass you for BS, right? If you had like a street party, the cop wasn't going to come by and enforce. If your kids were selling lemonade, right, they would catch a lot of hell if they came and give you a hard time over there. So police at the lowest level, military, you got to have it because there's male lions in the world. Otherwise, get rid of all the rest of it, because I think that's absolutely correct. The moral hazard, the lack of feedback mechanisms means that everything government touches turns to garbage. If you have any function of government, it should be promoting those kinds of communities, right? Promoting people helping each other, the Cajun Navy, these sort of beautiful voluntary interactions between people, rather than trying to displace it and replace it, to convert it into essentially a vote buying mechanism, which is, I think, why they're trying to get people on welfare, for example.
All right, Noah, closing thoughts on what we would put we put taxes to use. What should it be for? Is it just a giant moral hazard engine, or what?
Sure, the government is full of moral hazard cases. But I think that when you look at societies, you see that the mixed economy with basically capitalist production and robust welfare state is the worst form of organization in the world that humanity has ever devised, except for all the others. There's nowhere. I love living in this society. This is a great society. I think there are tweaks that we could use to make it a bit greater. I think that, we could be a bit richer than we are. I think the numbers that saying we could be, double, triple as rich as we are, that's not realistic. But I think that we could be richer, somewhat richer than we are. I think that we could run a lot of the things in our world a lot more rationally than we do. I think, and yet when I look at the overall results, I see that modern, basically capitalist mixed economies with redistribution and public goods and all the stuff we have now and income taxes and all these things are dream societies to essentially everyone else who's ever lived ever in the world. And I would much rather live in today's society than in America in past times. Obviously, part of that's because of technological progress, obviously. But, like, I think that there's a few things that are run worse than they used to be in America. There are some, certainly, like land use is run much worse, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to be a utopian and say this is the best possible world. But it's pretty damn good to the point where I am reluctant to, like, tear it up and rip it up, based on imagining that a theory could theorize us to utopia, and that way theorizing ourselves to utopia, ripping up our society and replacing it with a postulated theorized utopia that should work pretty well, or that we think in theory should be perfect and blah blah blah, that has not gone well in the world when we've tried it in various societies. Now, maybe it was just because those particular theories were bad, and then when we get the right utopian theory, we can tear up our existing society and make the right utopia. But I'll bet against it. I will use the precautionary principle, and I will say that I would rather evolve from where our society is now, have evolution instead of revolution in our institutions. That's basically my closing statement.
Well, Noah Smith, Peter St. Onge, thank you for participating in this lively conversation. I tried my best not to stomp on it too much.
And Noah, kudos, because we were ganging up on you in the end there. So seriously, you were a very good sport with that.
It was a pleasure.
Noah wins by default because everyone, the moderate lane always wins a debate.
Moderate. I'm trying to think of things that I'm radical on. Like I've poked fun at Austrian economics, but in terms of threats to our prosperity and the peace and happiness of our society, like libertarian economics right now is like 87th in the list. Like we need more libertarianism in so many areas of our society right now. That like I'm on the libertarian side now. I'm not ready to become a utopian libertarian, but I'm like me and Tyler Cowen, man. I'm with Tyler Cowen and the state capacity libertarians. That's my team right now.
Yeah, Noah, you fit squarely inside the stick figure drawing where the left ran into hell, and here you stand now, a full-blown right-winger in earnest in comparison.
Just because the ground moved under me, I guess.
Welcome, sir, to the land of the deplorables.
All right. No, libertarianism needs to come back. I'm going to bring it back. And even liking FDR, I'm going to be like an pro FDR libertarian. So I'm the only one.
We'll roll our eyes and say California corrupted his Texan genetics.
Hey, FDR was our greatest mass deportation in history. So FDR is coming back. He's going to be rehabilitated here.
Well, I would say Hoover more than FDR, but yes, FDR helped.
No, it was empirically FDR because we had the Depression, and so he shipped everybody.
Wasn't the biggest mass deportation in 32?
I don't know exactly the year. That would be an interesting question.
32 was the big, but FDR did about, I think, a third of it. So yeah, he was in there.
It was a bipartisan affair. Yeah.
It was a bipartisan affair. Everyone wanted to deport.
That's the Uniparty. We didn't discuss the Uniparty at all throughout this.
The biggest mass deportation in American history since 1960 was Obama's Secure Community Program, in which he deported about 400,000 people.
Wow, that's going to be interesting.
I think we should do a permanent. Yeah. We should do a permanent system in which we take 2 Mexicans for every studies graduate. In a 1-for-2 swap.
1-for-2 swap.
Here is here studies
endorsed. That's just all the humanities and soft social science graduates will find paradise in Mexico, and we will bring some guys who work in computer factories and car factories.
I'm actually fascinated what's going to happen now, right? Because Hispanics are trending Republican like very quickly. I think like Trump lost by like 6 points among Hispanics.
Well, and he won Hispanic men.
And he won men and lost women. So I would be fascinated if Hispanics turn right, what kind of backflips you were going to see. What kind of rhetorical.
You've seen it
Because
already.
it's-
Well, they're
It's
chauvinist.
all
You
about
saw it with the
election.
Irish, you
It's
saw it
not
with the
everything
Italians.
About anything else.
We've seen this movie before.
You're right. You're right. No, you're right. It's the Italians. In fact,
It's the Italians and the Irish.
if you haven't seen the movie Cabrini, it actually touches on a lot of this quite well. It's a
Is that about the
microcosm.
Chicago Cabrini Green?
It's Mother Cabrini, the Catholic nun who came and started all these great orphanages and hospitals and programs in New York. And the way the Italians were treated in that time period mirrors Mexicans. They're even called Latins. I say this as a 100% Italian Catholic from South Philly. So we have seen this movie play before. And now Italians are all a bunch of right-wingers. So there you go.
It's the circle of life. It has all happened before, and it will all happen again. I just, I want to get the new Reagan someday.
Well, gentlemen, signing off on behalf of my my friends here at Zero Hedge. A fun conversation.
All right, gents. Thanks. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me on. Good to meet you, Peter.
Good to meet you, Noah.